good morning, everybody. This is Robin Ayub from the Localization Fireside Chat, and welcome to another discussion on an interesting topic today. We're going to cover a bunch of topics. I have with me a guest and a good friend of the channel, and good friend, and everybody knows my guest today. He doesn't need to be introduced, but I'll do a bit of an introduction, and I'll let him tell his story. Stefan, Huyghe, thank you very much for being with me. I really appreciate it, and thanks for taking the time to be on the channel this morning. You're welcome to the channel anytime. I know it's our first conversation. You and I exchanged messages on LinkedIn, but we never really had a chance to talk. So first meeting, first introduction, nice to meet you. And finally, we have a chance to meet each other.
I feel like I'm with a celebrity this morning, so it's a big honor. Thank you for having me.
Same here. I guess two celebrities talking today, so that's good. You're well known in the industry, Stefan. Your name precedes you. Your reputation precedes you. Thank you very much for joining me. So for our audience, I'm sure we all know you in the industry, but just in case somebody who doesn't know you, tell us your story.
Ooh, and I'll try to be fast, and I've told it a couple of times already, so I will try to not elaborate too long. Originally, I'm from Antwerp, Belgium. I moved to Switzerland with my parents in my teens. That's how I kind of got involved with languages in the first place. I spoke Dutch at home, English in school at an American school in Bern, and French in my everyday daily life, just living in Switzerland. And my school was in the German part of Switzerland, so those are the four languages that I ended up effectively speaking. And then I moved via Greece and the Caribbean to the United States in '93. What else? Yeah, and then I ended up tumbling into localization by accident, really. Maybe it wasn't that big of a surprise with the language that I speak, but it wasn't until the end of the '90s that I had a conversation with a friend of mine who just had started working for a company called eTranslate. They later became translations.com, and they're now part of TransPerfect. And she was telling me the story how she was looking for somebody to come help her out, starting the French office in Paris. And she needed somebody badly who was fluent in English and French. And the more we were talking, I was like, hey, maybe I could come help you out. And like 2 weeks later, I was in Paris. And working my first localization job. And that's how I ended up being a project manager. I'm originally somebody that started in operations and then ended up in sales and marketing for other companies. But that's my story in a nutshell.
So how did you ended up in the US, though? You haven't transitioned to the US?
That's a chercher la femme question. I was living in Martinique for a half year, 3/4 of a year, doing a tour guiding job there, and I met a girl from San Francisco, and that's how I ended up in San Francisco. That's the story. I'll save you the details on that, Robin. It's much too juicy for.
Hey, maybe the details that the audience are looking for at this point. Yeah, I don't know. And anytime there's a story like this, people are, tell me more. But anyway, for the sake of the time, I guess it's all happy coincidence. I'm sure everything worked out. Your success story now. The rest is behind us, and there's a lot of future ahead of us. So
yeah.
So when we originally, started conversation, I've noticed that you've written on a lot of interesting topics regarding the industry. So you produced a lot of good pieces of content in the industry that it's actually, makes you think in a lot of ways about how you address variety of topics. So I've got a few of them, and this is based from your own writing. So I'd like to explore them a little bit. We have several of them today, so I'd like to cover. And hopefully we have the opportunity to cover all of them. But let's get started with localization-led growth. What do you mean by that? And if you can encapsulate or unpack it I know it's a large topic, but if you can encapsulate in a few minutes, that'd be great.
So it's really interesting because I was asked for the TBO Talent Forum to present a keynote on the true impact of AI and localization. And AI has kind of been a leitmotif for me in the last couple of years. I've done a lot of writing about that. So it was a prime occasion for me to kind of review all the things that I'd written in the past year or so. And one of the ideas that really came to mind was this localization led growth idea, which was based on the product led growth uh, principle that you can see in software, and that's been so successful in the last couple of years. And I started putting this together kind of as an ad hoc inspiration, and then a week or two before we had the actual presentation, I was meeting with the panel, and I was a little anxious about it because it was a concept that I'd kind of doctored up in my head, and to my big relief, it really resonated with the panelists. We had Huyghe from Spendesk and Sung Cho from Amazon, and I'd given them a list of topics to review and given them some questions that they could decide on whether they wanted to participate in those questions. And nobody had circled the localization led growth topic, and I had interpreted that as, maybe I'm off in a direction that doesn't make any sense. But it was actually the opposite. They thought it was so self-explanatory and evident that neither one of them wanted to volunteer to answer something about that, actually. So in essence, the concept, if I can quickly unpack it for you, is that localization is evolving from an afterthought to really becoming something that is a lot more prevalent and a primary consideration rather than a final step. And in software, we're already familiar with this concept of product-led growth, building the wagon as you ride it, so to speak. As soon as you have a product ready that can be rolled out, one of the ways you can learn about it and perfect it is by letting users take part in it and give you feedback. And localization-led growth kind of goes from the same vantage point, where you roll out your content in multiple languages globally, and the product gets released not just in English but in a bunch of languages, and you perfect the product with the feedback that you get, and you make it better as you go along.
So, am I to understand that when we are talking about localization-led growth, the fact it was before? I mean, we went through so many stages in this story, because we would go from 30 years ago, and I just dated myself. Sorry about that. To
I think I'm in the same boat, by the way. I'm not that far behind.
For somebody to say, you can't speak English, you can't buy our product. To now we are saying, no, let me translate it for you because I want to make sure that it's global. So English first, then other languages after. From what I'm hearing you say, it is all languages go out at the same time, help perfect the product. So are we from a growth perspective, this specific product, we're enabling, I'm just trying to, visualize this. We're enabling the customer to have a first-hand experience on the product in their own language, in their own demographic territory, etc.
Rather than and we're driving the growth by releasing the product in all languages at the same time, rather than to try to release it in English and then add languages on in layers.
So there's another dimension to that, Stefan, the dimension of policy. So I live in Canada, obviously, and there are many other jurisdictions around the world similar to Canada, where some people, like, they feel some demographic, they will feel like a little bit negative about, releasing something in one language but not releasing it simultaneously into another, and
Yep.
it lends to the thinking, and it's rightly so. Are we not as important as the other demographics? And
Yeah.
you hit a nail on the head here when you said simultaneously to all the other demographics. I think not just from a product growth perspective, but it elevates, or it lifts the other demographics to each other's levels, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, it's the story that kind of ties in with the Scott Schwalbach said something a couple of years ago in a panel discussion I was involved in as well, in which they were talking about linguistic QA and trying to get everything right linguistically, and how in his group at Amazon, they actually, because it's internal content that they produce for educational purposes, they actually don't try to get the content 100% correct linguistically anymore. What they do is they roll it out as fast as possible, so without any delay in all the languages, and then they have feedback mechanisms and triggers that might elevate a particular piece of content to be further reviewed by humans. So the emphasis is really on getting the product out, localized, and letting the users be the feedback loop, so to speak. And that can be both on an actual feedback level, where somebody leaves a comment and says, "Hey, this sentence doesn't sound right in French, and you should be reviewing that," and also an engagement. In his particular group, the way he was explaining it is that from a data perspective, they can evaluate whether engagement is going up or down, and based on that, they can go into a further review of the linguistic aspect of the content as well, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Thanks for explaining that. Appreciate it, Stefan. Now, the second topic that I have, if you don't mind addressing, is the language operation, so lang ops, and as you called it, a new paradigm in global expansion. I'm assuming they're related.
Yeah, so I mean, this ties in perfectly. Obviously, LangOps is AI related as well. It comes from the concept that where in the past communications were very one directional in localization. We would localize a website in order for people to be able to read it. As communications become much easier, and especially since we're at the dawn of the AI chatbot, and bi-directional communications, this one directional thing is not practical anymore at all, and communications are going to be a lot faster in the future than we have been used to in the localization realm, so to speak. So the new paradigm really is that, as Jochen Hummel says all the time, your customers are actually talking back right now, and they're expecting to be talked to in French, Chinese, or Japanese, whatever language you've addressed them in, so to speak. So we're moving towards what in LangOps you would call language factories, in which content gets produced instantaneously, and things are a lot more AI driven, so to speak.
So speaking of AI, now you have a piece was written around AI's role in supporting lesser spoken languages. Now, AI is a larger topic, and there's so many angles to this conversation, but on the lesser spoken languages, it's very interesting because it seems to me that most of the solutions are, this is just me, looking at the amount of data that's out there, either in people conversations or posts on media, etc. They seem to be focusing on, let's say, the top 10 languages around the world, and the solutions are always geared toward those top languages around the world.
Yep.
But you've got like few hundred other languages that people are, I don't know if we're focusing on or what is the issue there that we're not addressing them. Like, I feel like we're in Canada, for instance, there are some Aboriginal languages that needs to be resurrected, like they're disintegrating, but they need to be lifted up again and put back on the visible screen, if you will. Is that what you're trying to address in that AI piece that you've written?
Yeah, so I actually wrote about it in my AI and Loop newsletter, which is quite popular. I put out an article this morning that talks about the lesser spoken languages and the opportunities. It's one of these opportunities. I believe that for localization, the future can be really bright if we can adjust and we can take some of these opportunities that have been given. We can play a really important role, I believe, in helping the lesser spoken languages survive. Part of the challenge for AI developers with these languages is that they depend on data, unique data, in order to train your large language models properly. And I believe that LSPs in particular probably have the most data in some of these lesser spoken languages, so they can play a very active role helping develop AI and preserving some of these languages in a way that maybe otherwise would condemn them to extinction. I think that we can do it in several ways. First of all, we as language service providers possess data, and we know that the AI developers need data in order to train their large language models. We also have the connections and the technical know-how to consult with the AI houses and teach them about some of these languages as well. So I think there's a potential synchronicity there that allows us to be involved and give us a noble cause, so to speak, to pursue in this regard.
And there are some applications being developed in that regard as well. Like, I interviewed somebody on the channel a few months ago now, when I want to say about 3-4 months ago now, and that individual is an entrepreneur who started a new company, and it's primarily focusing on taking Hollywood video movies, etc. So they're normally dubbed to, let's say, the primary languages that I just mentioned earlier, the top 10 languages around the world. But this individual is focusing on the sub-Saharan languages, Indic languages, minority languages, where you were not going to get a big large studio house to dub the new Top Gun movie to that language. So, and it's pretty cool. They're using AI for it. It's amazing what the new technology is allowing us to do. And you're absolutely correct, Stefan, in terms of not just the LSPs who have the ability to perhaps help provide the data points for an artificial intelligence instance to make sure that we're keeping those languages alive, but also there is a possibility to reach out to those communities where there's still some people speaking those languages and collect data from them that would help us also build that and preserve that language.
Yeah, and then the last thing that I almost forgot to mention is we could probably help with the creation of synthetic data as well, and be at the helm of helping make data, so to speak, that doesn't necessarily exist because of the exposure we've had as language service providers.
Yeah, correct. I mean, synthetic data is good to have, but you would agree probably natural data is the way to go. But if you don't have it, of course, you're going to try to create something using technology.
Yep.
So speaking on the staying on the AI, and I know I've read your comments or your piece on the New York Times lawsuit, and you called it a turning point for AI and localization. What's your context there? Why is that?
Well, I think we've kind of jumped into this AI bath with without taking into consideration all the implications up front, and I believe that this lawsuit is but the tip of the iceberg on what's going to happen from a contention point of view with content. Of course, it's not always easy, I think, for entities to prove that their content was quote unquote stolen from them. But in this particular case, and maybe I can give some more background to the viewers about this before we elaborate. So this lawsuit came to be because the New York Times claims that OpenAI not only used their articles to train the large language models that then made up GPT, but they also weighed that content so heavily that when users would ask ChatGPT certain questions, the answers that were generated by the large language model would almost be verbatim what was in the New York Times articles. And so the contention here is, or the New York Times is saying, if you're going to be using our data in that sense, then you are dealing with intellectual property. And this is beyond the fair use doctrine. All these AI houses, they are now hanging their hat on the legal principle that the content that they're providing was scraped from the internet, and it is content that is quote unquote up for fair use. And thus, they don't owe anybody who's written the content a penny. The New York Times obviously is contending something quite different and is now asking a piece of the action. What's weird a little bit about this story is that at the outset, I believe that the New York Times has been working with Microsoft and OpenAI to provide this data and provide the content freely. So they're not completely blameless either, I think. But there's a lot of money involved, and I assume that this lawsuit is not going to be the last one that's going to be brought by a provider that has a lot of content and is going to want a piece of the action. So, what does this really mean for AI and beyond AI for language service providers that are implementing AI solutions? That's the big
So
question.
the question.
Who owns the data? It's not unlike the age old conversation we've been having about translation memory. Who owns the translation memory? It's always been the customer. But in this case, I don't know that you can so easily make that distinction. So it's really interesting where this is going to go legally. How are they going to unravel this bowl of spaghetti legally? Is my question. What do you think?
But what I'm thinking about is like there's two sides for this coin. I mean, once you like we always talked about who owns the data. You bring up a very good point. Who owns the memory? That's the kind of question that always come up in the localization world. But in this case, when you put something on the internet in a public domain, it is in public domain. If you want to protect it and put it behind a payment wall, meaning that I paid for that and I can read it, or I privatize the data that you can have no access to it. But imagine everybody on the internet saying, "Oh no, you don't own the data; it's mine," even though it's on the internet and millions of people have seen it already or read the article, etc. I'm just trying to figure out like what kind of case it's going to be when it goes to court, and that court is hearing the case. How are they going to prove that in this case that this data cannot be used? It's already used. It's already in the internet. It's already public.
I think, and I'm just playing devil's advocate
Oh,
here.
I like that.
I'm no lawyer, but I think that the New York Times is saying essentially that because their content is behind the paywall and it's paying content, that
Oh, it's a paid content.
they should they should be remunerated for that intellectual property. I'm sure this is going to be really not a short process for them to figure it out. And it's also my understanding, as I said, that it's not like OpenAI went and stole the content. The New York Times was an active participant in all that,
That's right.
from my understanding. So it's a little bit insidious to say that afterwards
Stefan,
that
I mean,
they should
here's
be
another twist
remunerated.
to all this. The articles that where the contention is right now, I'll bet you those articles were Copilot written by AI as well.
Yeah, undoubtedly, undoubtedly.
So, like I get your point. I mean, but the point here is like on a 100,000 foot level, kind of a general statement. AI needs to be carefully contemplated in any scenario. On a personal
Yeah,
level, on a business level, I get your point. Before diving in, before jumping in, make sure you have some sort of a parachute pack, because it may end up hurting the business or the individual versus the intended initial consequences that you came up with, the intended, what you wanted to do. You wanted to do good, obviously, but sometimes it reflects negatively. It depends on how you use it and who's using it. It cannot be using, and this is my general feeling. People heard, and like everything else in life, free is good. And, people jump into free. If you put a free on anything, you got to line up and everywhere. So people heard that AI is going to allow us to do things for free, low cost. It's going to allow me as a business to cut my cost down. And they jumped in 2 feet first without asking anything. And now I think, like, you can see it, like, in somebody sent me an email. I can tell, like, it's AI written email. I can tell, like, it's
yeah,
an AI written post. I can tell, content that's written by AI without human intervention. You can immediately detect that, and you don't need a
yeah,
genius to figure this out. However, the intended, way of using AI, it was more intended to assist me, help me. If I'm doing something, it makes it better, improves it, not necessarily replace me. And I'm on the beach somewhere and I tell AI, hey, produce 17 blogs for me today. And all of a sudden those 17 blogs are posted.
yeah. I think you're absolutely right. Using AI without any human intervention is not a very good idea. I think Diego Crescieri had a post on LinkedIn in the last few days where he started by saying, I wish, and I'm paraphrasing, I wish GPT would start a social media post with something else than exciting news." And of course, his post started with exciting news, and then I wish GPT would stop suggesting exciting news. There's keywords that you recognize if you work with GPT on a regular basis that come
Oh,
back, and that
100%.
tip the veil.
Those
The
emojis,
veil
man,
away.
as soon as I see an emoji in, a rocket flying or something, I feel, oh, okay, so
Yeah,
AI produced.
yeah. So now I don't know that I agree with that completely. I have to tell you, Robin, because I put it. I put the emojis on my paragraphs at times too, but it's definitely not GPT generated. Although, as all of us, we all use AI to generate content on some level, but there's nothing that gets copied and pasted directly from OpenAI's GPT into something that goes
It
live.
definitely
But
needs
it's
to
a
be.
great,
It definitely needs to be monitored and policed
yeah,
by a human. I'm joking about the emoji. Everybody uses emoji, but when you see emoji used in a sentence that it sounds robotic, it sounds like came out of a machine. Then
yeah,
it's a combination of two, I guess. Now,
yeah.
if you don't mind, just moving on to a few other topics I would like to cover. You talked about minimal viable language solution. What's this about? MVLS, you called it.
So this is actually, it's very much connected to the topics that we've brushed on before this morning. And it's actually something that the idea was introduced to me by my good friend Ditsius Graus from Native Localization. And it's something that he's been trying to implement with his clients. So essentially, it follows the same principle of MVP, minimal viable product, that is a software idea where you build the bare minimum and then you release it out to the public in order to weigh it and see how the market receives it, and then you fine tune it. So in that sense, minimal viable language solutions indicates the same thing. Rather than to translate everything and try to finish a completely localized entity at the outset, start with the low hanging fruit and where you know that you're going to be having the most efficiency and strategic focus, releasing translated or localized content. And by measure of efficiency there and the feedback that you get, you decide whether it's worthwhile to continue with the localization or change your strategy in that sense. And maybe, obviously it's an AI driven principle as well, where you most likely release a lot of the content with an AI pass, and maybe you wait for feedback in order to perfect certain things and get humans involved to do the post editing while the product is already in review by the people that are using it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. Now, okay, you do the bare minimum at the front end, but over time, do you continue, or you measure the outcome and then you continue?
Yeah, I think it's all connected with measuring and evaluating, or the advances in measurements and evaluation that the current technological capabilities give us.
Are we into a discussion of outcome-driven localization versus localization? I think that's for the first 2-3 topics that we talked about. It sort of talks about outcome-driven localization. Basically, I'm not just translating for the hell of translating. I'm actually translating because I'm seeking an outcome, either a new customer or selling more or
Yeah.
improving productivity, or however you want to measure it.
I really like that terminology. I'm going to make sure I write that down because it's a really good term you point there. Outcome based localization, I think is a great way of encapsulating all of the things we've talked about this morning. We have the ability to be a lot more deliberate and personalized going forward. As a matter of fact, I think it's always been one of our aims in localization to be personalizing content. And for the first time, we have a technology that allows us to personalize the product in an almost immediate way that never was available before. Either it was not budget friendly enough or it was not fast enough. And now both of these barriers are being removed, and our customers have the ability to present a product that can be a lot more personalized and speak to the individual customer. And we can measure along the way what the results are, whether something is working or not. And I think that's a fundamental difference that is coming to life now as well, is that we have a lot more direct feedback as opposed to where we were in the past to enable us to do it.
100%. Now, before we dig into the other topics, I really wanted to ask you this before we started the conversation. As soon as I started thinking about our conversation and, getting together over this podcast, I'm interested in your view, in general view, like regarding the industry. So where do you think, in your view, the industry is at now? And where do you think the industry is going to be, not 10 years down the road, but 5 years down the road?
Because I don't have a crystal ball, and
nobody does. Me and you speculating.
One of the things that I highlighted in my keynote this week was this computer. One of the first computer predictions about the evolution of the world, and it was recorded in 1966. It's one of the first computer programs that put out a prediction as to where humanity would be, and they were actually predicting that we were going to go extinct by the year 2040. So it wasn't a very positive evolution. I think that some of the dynamics in our industry still have to be uncovered because things are moving so fast. However, there's a couple of patterns that I see that are really encouraging to me as far as the thriving of the localization industry. I think there's a lot more content that's going to be translated than in the past because of these new technological abilities. So there's a huge amount of content that traditionally would not get translated and localized because it was time sensitive, because it was too expensive, all the reasons that we've talked about already. And now we have an opportunity to help our customers with that content in a lot more efficient way. Yes, a lot of the content translation is going to be automated in the future, but there's going to be a segment remaining that will involve human interaction. So I hear this constantly from translators, how they're worried about not being able to make a living anymore. I don't see it that way. I think the role of the linguists is going to change fundamentally, and they will become more post editors than translators from scratch. But it's not like a kid that does complex math with a calculator. Can you do the square root of a number by hand? Sure, but it's just easier to have the calculator there. And I think AI is going to be fulfilling the same role. There's going to be content always that will have to be reviewed very carefully by human translators because there's legal aspects involved, because there's sensitivities that make it so that you need to take that extra precaution. And at the same token, there's going to be a huge amount of content processed that in the past didn't even come up for consideration to be localized. So I think those two things, those two tracks can exist at the same time. And I think the future is bright for the localization industry to stay involved with language-related activities, but also to evolve and play different roles, maybe that we haven't even thought of at this point because it's difficult to anticipate. But I think we have to adjust and adapt our modus operandi with the times. There's no doubt about that. Things are changing, and we have to evolve.
I have several thoughts on this one, if you don't mind. One is
Sure, I'd love to know.
One is the localization industry needs to think of itself not an isolated industry anymore, but part and parcel of the knowledge base industry. So we used to be, as you mentioned earlier in one of your comments, you mentioned that translation used to be an afterthought. If you have a content somewhere down the road, you decide to translate. Oh, I need to translate it. So we're sort of like the last piece in the knowledge base industry. If you draw it as a workflow process. Now, I feel like we are a lot more integrated we need to be a lot more integrated in a knowledge base industry as a service, intimately integrated. And how do we do that? I think we're going to be a lot more data driven industry than a transaction driven industry in the future. And one of the topics that I just always comes to mind is the ability now, and I love your opinion on this one, the ability now that we have as technology is becoming more and more available to produce content in native languages. So I can come in and I can do a post in 10 languages if I want to, natively using generative AI. Yes, I can edit it, and I can make sure that it's not necessarily 100% accurate, but I can get to 95% accuracy without using any human in it. How is and I know, like a lot of people would say, oh, this is going to be the end of localization if we start talking like this. But I mean, I'm not going to be the one who prevent this, because technology is there already. People are using it already. But we need to adapt to that technology. There's a bunch of services that we can offer. You mentioned earlier the translators, and I'm having those conversations with translators as well, telling me, hey, the world is over. I'm going to be replaced with AI. And I'm thinking, no, you just need to adapt a little bit and use AI to your advantage. We're still talking as an industry about 2,000 words per day as a standard productivity day rates. I mean, with all these technologies, we're still talking about 2,000 words per day. Like, where's that going?
Yeah. So, it's a really interesting point you bring up. And I had Ronaldo Ditzinger on one of my Loke discussions not too long ago. He's the president of Supertext. And what's peculiar with his background is that Supertext is originally a content writing outfit, not necessarily, they came to translation through content creation. So I had a really interesting conversation with him about this, because he was kind of seconding my thought process on this. I think there's an opportunity for the localization industry to be involved with multilingual content creation, and we could become multilingual content creators instead of translators of other people's content in different languages. I think the future holds possibility for customers to roll out personalized content and solutions that might not even get translated. It gets produced specifically for an audience, and the content that is produced for a campaign, which is the equivalent, might not be exactly the same content because we're producing it for, a Tunisian audience instead of for a Canadian or an American audience. And, when we're doing it in France, we're talking about soccer. And when we're doing it in the United States, we're talking about baseball, to, pick off something really simplistic. But that's kind of the gist of it. And I think there's a real opportunity for language service providers to become multilingual content providers.
That's right. And, for I'm one of the burning question I always had about this industry since I've been at it for 21 years is, and I attended the first, and I remember the first, I think it was the only conference I attended. It was Loke World in Montreal. It came into Montreal in 2006, I think, or something. I can't remember the date. And I've always noticed that we're very inward thinkers in the way we think about our industry. We, yes, we talk about it in maybe because we're afraid. I don't know what it is. What is the psychology behind it? I come from various other industries. I'm from the tech background, so I've worked in the technology sector for many years, and we always talked about like white papering. We talked about solution solving, problem solving via solutions. White paper, you publish it. You talk about how you solve the problem for a market, for a customer. I don't see that here. I always talk about, I always hear the problems within the industries being discussed. How do we produce more, or streamline the input from a coming in, or how do we design a workflow? We have software that does that, but we never talk about it. How are we solving it for a market? How are we solving it for the tech industry? How are we solving it for the manufacturing industry? It's I feel like we're very inward thinkers, and I don't know
Do you think?
I don't know if this is true or not. Maybe just my feelings.
Yeah. Do you think it's because traditionally we've always been an afterthought, and it's been difficult for us to get a seat around the table at the very beginning and conduct conversations with other departments, if you want, within organizations? And it's because of this silo effect that we are just coming in on the back end and are not really used to advocating for ourselves up front. That's really, if I can be honest about it, that's really what I was aiming at with this idea of localization led growth in the beginning of our conversation here. The goal really there is to make localization a revenue driving activity, and make it considered upfront, and make design of products, software or other, an international endeavor from the beginning, because companies will realize now, with the time and the budget barrier that much lower, that it makes sense to think of a product as a global entity from the get-go.
So a few things. One is, this industry started to become, or to take shapes, about 30 years ago. There always been language industry since the Babylon days, 6,000, 10,000 years ago. People always needed somebody to translate to somebody. Now, we started calling it an industry, I would say, about 30, 35 years ago, starting to take some form, some sort of a shape. And immediately, right within that time frame, and if you look at the economics of our industry does not exist because we're philanthropists, right? It exists because we're business people, and business people need to do two things: generate revenue, generate profitability, right? At the beginning, profitability was high, things were going well, and then the commoditization discussion starts to happen, and you can see it as a phenomenon. The price pressure started. Everybody went from being a professional, having this conversation, and I've had this conversation many times. A translator is equal to any other professional, lawyer, doctor, etc., because they went and studied, and rightly so, the same amount of academic years, the same amount of qualification. Why not? Should not be considered as any other profession. I think the industry shot themselves in the foot by competing against each other too much and driving the price down. And then the economics are not working out. So let's figure this out now. So it's starting to become, we created a problem and trying to create a solution for it by talking about how we solve productivity issues, profitability issues, but we're not really focusing on what started it to begin with. That's my point.
Good point.
I don't know. What do you think?
No, I think you're spot on. It's a systematic thing that we have brought upon ourselves, and now we have an opportunity. I believe, though, to get out of the conundrum and be part of the bigger picture with the evolution of technology right now, I believe.
And the evolution of technology, which is very important, bring me to the last point that I would like for you to address. And I've had a podcast on this one a few days ago, and I recorded it. I haven't published it yet, but balancing AI innovation with a human expertise. Can you address that?
Yeah, I think we're faced with two things that are not multi-exclusion, that don't exclude each other, so to speak. We can be super efficient with new technology and still be reliant on human input. As you noted already in our conversation before, it's really difficult to let large language models operate on their own entirely. They hallucinate. Uh, they can be a liability from a content creation point of view. They definitely need to be monitored. And so we need to adapt to new methodologies and workflows that make sense for the language industry in that regard just the same. So, and balancing it out might not always mean the same thing for different workflows. There's going to be instances in which the content can be localized without much human input, and there's going to be other instances where we really need to monitor it carefully and get more people involved. It's an ongoing process, but anybody who's involved with AI on a daily basis, like I am, and I assume you are too, Robin, knows that we cannot let it operate independently entirely. So there's lots of opportunities to balance this out and to keep people involved in the localization industry, but also improve our output tremendously. Obviously, where you brush up on the 2,000 word per day idea. We're a long cry away from that. I think at this point.
So to me, it sounds like, I always make the comparison between, the autopilot on a Tesla, for instance, on a Canadian highway, straight highway, 10,000 kilometers long from one coast to coast. You put an autopilot on, unless a moose cross over the highway, you're safe. Nothing's going to happen. The car will drive you to where you're going. But I imagine if you do the autopilot thing on a Tesla in the middle of downtown San Francisco or Los Angeles, you are going to have issues.
Yeah, it's more dangerous for sure. Although Elon Musk probably would have something to say about that, and might not necessarily agree. I know Tesla is doing a pretty good job at making those things autonomous, so to speak. But I agree with you that bad things are going to happen if we just let it operate entirely on its own, and so we have to put contingencies in place in order to prevent that.
So one thing we didn't cover, and I can't help but cover this one. So we talked a lot about what our industry is doing about AI. What do you think the market wants to achieve with AI, in your opinion? Like the consumer of our services, what are they hoping to achieve with AI, do you think?
I think AI is permeating everything at the moment, not just the localization industry. It's bringing the same efficiencies in many other industries. It's doing a lot of coding. I'm under the impression as well. I can't open up my Twitter and not see posts about it writing Python code.
Oh, I've tried it. I've tried coding with it.
And what were you?
Pretty good. I wrote I wanted to do an automation in what was it? Microsoft related application, and I wanted to write a Visual Basic macro. So I went to GPT-4 and I told it what I wanted to create, and created the code for me. Now, if somebody who understands codes, I read the code and it looked pretty good. There were some parameters I have to change, so I changed them. And I put it in the Visual Basic module in Microsoft, and I ran it, and it runs perfectly. Now, if I would have to actually, go back 30 years ago and try to learn my coding days, it will take me forever. This one is pretty easy. Now, mind you, it is a small sample of less complicated ways you can use it. At least for my sample in project that I was involved in, it worked.
It's a productivity enhancer without a doubt, and I experienced this myself. I have a background in database development, and whenever I'm running into a database issue now, I just go to GPT and I ask what the solution is by prompting it. And while before maybe I would be scouring the internet for user groups and people that have run into a similar issue, Now I can actually ask a very specific question and get a very specific answer back. That's nothing short of mind blowing. I was in a podcast with Konstantin Dranch from Custom MT a while back, and he challenged me to make a custom GPT that would be an LQA, and we laughed it off in the event. And I went into GPT and spent literally 20 minutes prompting my way into it making a custom GPT. I can send you the link, Robin. It's simply amazing. You put in a source text and a translation, and it gives you a 7-8 points full report of whether it's culturally appropriate, whether there's any mistakes in it, where it could be more fluent, you name it. It's absolutely mind-blowing. So, it's an absolute productivity
100%.
enhancer without a doubt.
100%. Hey, listen, I want to thank you for your time today. Sorry, we're coming up to the time here. I appreciate Stefan for joining me. Always, well, it's my first time, and I hope you make a point of coming back. You're always welcome to the channel anytime. I know today we're
gonna have a real coffee. We're gonna have a real coffee for sure.
I can't wait, man. I can't wait. I want to see you. I want to see you. I want to hang out with you. We seem to be like-minded. I want to share some more ideas. I know we only have 1 hour today, but I wish you lived a little closer. I live on one end of the continent. You live on the other end of the continent. I hope we can get to see each other at some event someplace and spend some time together. You're a very good person to get to know. You're full of expertise that I encourage our audience to reach out to you and find out more about what you can do, what you can offer to them. And I hope our audience will take me up on this and reach out to you. Stefan is not hard to find. He's all over LinkedIn. And if you go to LinkedIn, you are going to see Stefan. I can guarantee you that. Thank you very much. Stefan, any last words before we stop the recording?
It's been such a pleasure being on the podcast, Robin. I really, really enjoyed it. I've been waiting for us to meet and have a conversation for a very long time, and it was a real honor. Thank you for having me.
The honor is mine. Thank you so much, Stefan, for joining me. Appreciate it. For our audience, if you like what we do on this podcast, please join us by subscribing to our channels. YouTube and all the podcast channels, Spotify, Apple Cast, sorry, and also the rest of the podcasting platforms that you are familiar with. Please join us. Please participate in this conversation by commenting on our content and sharing the content. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.